open the webinar. Welcome those who are coming in and joining us for this first of three sprints that we're hosting. So I'll just give it another 30 seconds before formally kicking it off. But thank you all for joining us on a Friday afternoon. But for some, let's try again, a Friday afternoon. Why did I say that? A Tuesday afternoon, as distinct from a Tuesday morning for others. All right, so, well, let's kick off, everybody. And a big thank you to um, our two speakers, as well as our participants, our audience. Thank you so much for joining this event, which is the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia and the World Benchmarking Alliance are in a sprint session times three. Very exciting opportunity for BCSDA and WBA to come together, which we have recently done as allies of one another. And we're very excited that we're kicking off with a sprint session over the next few weeks to talk about the importance of benchmark and findings that the World Benchmarking Alliance have been undertaking now for a little while and will be releasing further insights over the next few months. Today's conversation is about nature benchmarking and what leading practice looks like and how to scale it. Today being Tuesday, the 21st of October, 2025, not Friday. I don't know why I said that. And our speakers today are Jenni Black from the World Benchmarking Alliance and Josué Castro from BWD Strategic. And I am your host, Andrew Petersen, the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. So welcome to this 30-minute sprint, which, as I say, we hope you will enjoy as a focused session designed to bring global insights directly to Australian business and business leaders in particular. I'm joining you today from the land of the Camaragal people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, paying my respects to elders past and present, and particularly extending the respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So a quick bit of context and an introduction to Jenni. We're turning our attention tonight in the first of three to nature and what leading practice actually looks like when companies do take nature positive action seriously. The World Benchmarking Alliance has recently undertaken a very longitudinal assessment of almost, I think it's 700 of the world's most influential companies through its nature benchmark. I'm not going to spoil the alert as to what the findings were, but there are some really interesting markers in relation to progress. But there's also some important understanding for business to have around what are the major blind spots, and understanding, therefore, about not just the question of impact, but also just as fundamentally the question of dependency by business on nature. So for Australia, we perform, and I'm not going to spoil it by telling you, but Jenni's going to share that in a minute. And it's interesting then that the opportunity, I think, lies in then scaling what we're going to hear about and then working on to connect disclosure with impact. And that's why I'm delighted that Josué is with us today, because the Business Council for Sustainable Development actually has a work in progress on nature action with its members. And Josué, in addition to giving some reflection on the presentation by Jenni and the findings, is actually going to share with you what we're doing. So to unpack this first, let me welcome Jenni Black, who is the Nature Transformation Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Jenni and her team work globally, as you're about to find out, helping companies, investors, and policy makers use data to drive change. So a big thank you, Jenni, for joining us from Amsterdam. Although, as Jenni says, you couldn't tell because it looks dark. Such is the way, ironically, that in Australia we have daylight saving except for one state. Go figure. So, Jenni, over to you, and look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Andrew, and for the invitation. Yes, of course, I'm in the Netherlands, which means I'm even further away from it being Friday afternoon for me, which is a bit of a pity. Um, I will just start sharing my screen. I promise that I'm not gonna sort of drag through a super boring long presentation, but there's just a few slides that I'd like to speak to. Yeah, as Andrew mentioned, I'm the head of nature at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and as an organization, I'm aware that some of you probably don't know that much about us, but what we do is we work to really hold 2,000 of the world's most influential companies accountable for their contribution to sustainable development. And we do that by producing open source, free, publicly available benchmarks, which really allow people to understand and compare company performance across 7 different topics. I head up the nature team where we look at 750 companies, and we work a lot with policymakers, with investors, directly with companies, NGOs, standard setters, kind of that whole ecosystem that we call our alliance, and that we're really pleased that you've joined. In order to sort of spread understanding of where we are and then what needs to happen. And Andrew mentioned that WBA works globally, but we're really happy and excited because we actually opened up an Australia hub back in March 2025. So we have a couple of people working specifically in Australia on Australian issues. So hopefully you'll be sort of seeing and hearing more of WBA in Australia over the coming years. I won't go into this in too much detail, but I know that there's an awful lot of frameworks, methodologies, standards, a lot of acronyms in the nature space. So you might be thinking, oh God, another one. Is this what we really need? But the assessment methodology that we use in the benchmarks really builds on what is already out there. We basically try to compile what are stakeholders expecting companies to do on nature. So our methodology uses a lot of what's in TNFD, the Science-Based Targets Network, kind of standards and expectations also that have been developed by WBCSD and GRI and others. So we're not trying to sort of add to the noise. We're trying to really help understand how a company's doing with regards to all of this, which is just really important for us to kind of make that clear at the beginning that we're not sort of another different standard. And everything that we do is really developed in consultation with a whole bunch of experts that I won't go through. You can see them on the screen, as well as companies and sort of impacted stakeholders as well. I mentioned that we look at 750 companies in the nature benchmark. We look at them from across 18 key sectors. So it's a really broad benchmark. We know that there are a lot of sectoral deep dives and things which can be really useful, but it can also be very useful to have an understanding of sort of broadly where is the market at. And companies don't opt in to being assessed by us. They're selected by our research team mainly based on their size and sort of control of certain market share and things like that. So we're not only looking at progressive companies, we're not specifically pointing the finger at companies who are like not doing that much. We're really trying to provide an understanding of where the largest, most influential actors from these high impact industries are. And this is the last bit of kind of background before I get into some of the findings. But as well as the range of companies being quite broad, the range of issues that we look at within the benchmark is also quite broad. So we've made the very conscious decision to ensure that people and social issues are embedded into everything that we do. So you'll see that there are some kind of social indicators in there. We also look at governance specifically. A lot of our research shows, unsurprisingly, that having certain governance structures and accountability structures in place can be quite an important enabling factor that enables companies to take more robust action in a way that's kind of really bedded into their decision-making structures. And of course, we have kind of more traditional, classic environmental ecosystem, environmental indicators related to whether companies are doing an impact and dependency assessment, and then things on plastics, on water use, on ecosystem conversion. That's all available online. I mentioned that everything that we do is free and publicly available. So that's you can kind of dig into that if you're interested. And in terms of results, Andrew, I saw that you stopped yourself from giving a spoiler alert from the results in the introduction. So these results are looking at the benchmarks that we've published from 2022 to 2024. And I should say that the research team is just now finalizing an update, which is going to be published in January 2026. And that's exciting for us because it's the first time that we're able to really talk about what progress has been made. But from the first round of assessments, Australian companies perform slightly better than average, getting a score of 17 out of 100 compared to, that slide should say 15 out of 100 as well. So kind of just above average. But interestingly, some of the issues that actually a lot of Australian stakeholders have talked to us quite a lot about, particularly water issues and then ecosystem conversion and restoration. Australian companies are actually scoring weaker than average, weaker than the kind of global average on those, but showing real areas of strength when it comes more to things like soil health, hazardous waste, plastics, and air pollutants. So I'm very interested in seeing if that still holds in the next round of assessments, particularly because I think one of the main findings that we had from the first benchmark was that from, when we're talking about 2022, 2023, nature really was a huge blind spot for most companies. So less than 5% of companies were assessing their impacts on nature. And interestingly, less than 1% were assessing their dependencies, which is yeah, it was a little bit surprising for a lot of our audiences who assumed that companies might actually be further ahead in thinking about how they depend on nature. But the results show that that actually wasn't the case. There was a little bit more focus on impacts. But it really reflects the fact that nature had kind of been just coming on the agenda because a lot of companies showed evidence of doing something or of getting started. They might have mentioned that they were starting to conduct a materiality assessment, but they hadn't published the results and things like that. So there was a good bulk of companies, sort of 30%, 40% of companies were mentioning that they were starting to get to grips with this issue. But of course, it takes a little bit of time for that to then filter through into their annual reports and sustainability reports and the kind of sources that we can use. But this definitely, the sort of first benchmark came out just before COP16 and the kind of global biodiversity framework and target 15 of that. And I think it definitely just really highlighted that nature wasn't a part of company decision making or of analyzing opportunities and risks to the business in the way that it really deserves to be. And I'll come back to this in a minute because this is something where we do kind of see some progress in the second version. Something else that we found across the board, this slide, it talks about plastics, but we saw this also a lot, particularly when it comes to water use and water pollutants as well, was that there is a really large gap between qualitative reporting and then quantitative evidence to actually back that up. So an area where we really recommend companies sort of consider in their disclosures, because we look at publicly disclosed information, is to really, a lot of the time companies have information on the quantitative impact of some of the things that they're doing, but it doesn't make it into the reporting. So we were speaking to a company about they'd reduced they said that they had like a program that was like reducing the amount of plastics in their packaging. But then, of course, they actually had this data that showed that it was reducing the plastics by 20%, which was equivalent to however many thousands of tons of plastic. And it's like being a little bit more specific with the disclosure really enables stakeholders, whether that's investors or NGOs or others, to differentiate between, sort of essentially greenwashing kind of statements and then where credible action is being taken. So that's something that we highlight because it's quite a recurring theme across several different topics. I think one of the strongest findings was that there's a huge gap between the best practices that are already being implemented by at least one company and the average scores in the benchmark. And this slide is a little bit hard to read, maybe the graph, but essentially the difference between the pale brown dot shows the average score of a company in the benchmark who are not in the top five. And the dark brown dot shows if you compile all the best practice into a hypothetical company, what would they score? So the difference between the leaders and the sort of laggards is really huge. And I think that often as an NGO community, we can be quite focused on always pushing for something new, for something, always pushing the envelope. But the results really show that the sort of the difference between what is possible and what is being done is already really big. So actually there's quite a lot of work to do there just in terms of scaling up practices that are already feasible. And we know that they're already feasible because at least one company is doing them. And the last thing I'll say on this is it was also interesting because good practice is really spread across a lot of companies. It's not really concentrated in just a small group. We had leading performers from every region, every sector, and some companies who scored really poorly overall. Maybe they scored 5 out of 100. They have one little area where they're like really leading. And it's very interesting. And we want to talk to more companies to understand how and why that has happened, because we know that a lot of the time a materiality assessment hasn't occurred. But of course, there's good reason why companies have started to focus where they have. So that's all the old findings from the data that we've already published. I'll skip this slide, I think, because I think we want to make sure that we have enough time. And I mentioned in January we'll be publishing our second round of assessments. Now, the bad news is that the methodology has become more robust. So actually, a lot of scores have gone down. That's largely because thanks to TNFD and the updated GRI standard and others, basically there's the good news is that there's a lot more clarity on what is expected now. But it does mean that some scores have gone down because the methodology has become a bit more robust. But the good news is that every element in the methodology is met by at least one company. So we're not asking for anything that is not possible. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, scaling up what is already possible would have a completely transformative impact. So that's really what we want to be focusing on in the next couple of years. And we do see that there's major progress in some key areas, especially related to assessing and disclosing nature-related impacts and dependencies. I think we look at 9 Australian companies within the nature benchmark. Last time around, not a single one sort of scored for these topics. This time around, and this is preliminary data, it looks like 3 are, and those 3 are not TNFD adopters. So those are companies who are not adopting TNFD, which I think is always the first statistic used is sort of no TNFD adopters, but is an awful lot of companies, not only in Australia, but also New Zealand, Canada, the UK, elsewhere, who are really making kind of credible progress there. And we're very excited to see how those materiality and impact and dependency assessments then affect the company's kind of actions and prioritization of the topics. Because as I mentioned, the benchmark is broad and it is difficult to know where to get started. But yeah, we're gonna kind of really excited to dig into some analysis on that. And I've been told that January is a terrible time to launch anything in Australia, so we'll be hosting a full Australian launch in March with our two colleagues who are there based in Australia. I will leave it there, Andrew, because I would definitely want to hear, yeah, some more from the other speakers.
Thanks, Jenny. And that was very clear and a very timely overview, actually, because of the conversation that's going on in Australia at the moment in relation to our nature strategy and its implementation by the federal government. So that's quite a timely insight for that. Let's now bring in our colleague and friend, Jose from BWD Strategic, and to give us, I think, some important Australian reflections because this is Jose's daily job, and how these findings are correlating with the work that he's undertaking at the moment, and particularly because there's no such thing as a free webinar. The notion of our Nature Action Program, which we're co-delivering with our colleagues at BWD Strategic around the role of our pilot work on the nature maturity assessment. But Jose, firstly, over to you. Thank you for joining us. What are your reflections about the findings that Jenny just outlined?
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Jenny. It was a really fantastic presentation. And as you said, Andrew, some very timely insights aligned not only to where many companies are in Australia when thinking about nature, but I think also telling us something very important about the challenges that many businesses feel they face when engaging with their nature journey. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Josué Castro. I'm the nature lead at BWD Strategic. We're a global boutique sustainability strategy consultancy based in Australia. We have offices in the United States as well. And in both our American and Australian operations, nature has become a really big focus for us. For me, since 2023, leading the practice here in Sydney. I wanted to make a couple of overarching observations and then say something about the nature maturity assessment. The first thing is to riff off the theme Andrew started with there, thinking about the Australian context. Many businesses that we have engaged with continue to prioritize, for perfectly understandable reasons, a focus on climate and preparing for mandatory climate disclosures vis-a-vis nature. But make no mistake, nature and the pressure for alignment on nature is coming. It's very much not on the horizon. It's already very much in the space. By some counts, outside of Australia, approximately 50 jurisdictions around the world are some way on a path towards either voluntary or mandatory corporate reporting requirements on nature-related risks. And in the Australian context, it's important to remember that whilst the issue of nature and nature policy is du jour at the federal level, with some contending views on how much positive progress has been made there, you are also seeing that beginning to be integrated into state and territory level regulation as well, as relates to the built environment, as relates to broader policy in managing the urban environment and so on. It's also increasingly and very correctly considered a part of climate mitigation, climate risk mitigation and adaptation. So there's a number of reasons why, from a positive perspective, businesses need to start thinking about nature very seriously. In addition to that, obviously, we already have some legal findings in Australia to suggest that directors have a fiduciary duty to disclose nature-related risks and opportunities. That's actually now reflected, I think, in South Australian legislation, at least in a bill. that's currently under consideration. And for those risk wonks in the audience, you might be aware that the infamous global risk standard ISO 31000 is actually currently under review, in part to accommodate a better understanding of complex indirect and systemic risk. As I've written about recently, really investing in that nature capability is a great way to get thinking about the way that those risk transmission channels work. Two quick recommendations, and then to the work we're doing with BCSDA. Number one, it all feels very complex, and it's easy to get caught up in the challenge of not having enough data at a corporate level, there not being enough of an understanding of nature-related data globally. We've interacted with well over 30 businesses around Australia over the last 12 to 18 months. The advice that we get from leading players is you have to get started, embrace the complexity. The only way to know and to begin to build your nature capability is to start that journey. How else will you know what data you have and what data you lack? And more importantly, you have to begin to understand where you're going to prioritize your efforts. No one expects that every single base will be covered, but the only way that you will understand and make a defensible case for why you focused where you can is to understand, and this goes to Jenni's very important point, understand your nature dependencies and impacts. The second thing I'd add there is there's also another misconception that this is a very complex, exhaustive, prohibitively difficult process to run through, and that's not the case. The TNFD LEAP assessment, which is what I and my colleagues at BWD have specialized in, we've run effective decision useful pilots of the LEAP in 10 weeks. And with a commensurate focus, forgive me, commensurate budget, all of that done through agreeing with our clients on a very tight scope that still meets the requirements of the TNFD, whilst at the same time giving you and your senior leadership an understanding of the value of conducting that assessment. So it is possible to do this in a way that fits your specific circumstances and gets you ready for your next step in disclosures. Finally, and as a fantastic example of how easy it is to start on that journey, as Andrew has mentioned, we're proud to have partnered with BCSDA on rolling out the WBCSD's Nature Maturity Assessment, which is a practical and completely confidential tool to help participants understand how prepared they are to integrate nature into business decisions. Our role in this is to work with BCSDA on the rollout of the maturity assessment to BCSDA members, to review the output of that maturity assessment, and then to support participants with highly tailored decision useful advice on the next steps that they should take on their nature journey. We're really excited to start that process with BCSDA. I think the first tranche is already well underway, and we look forward to continuing to work with this network to advance all of you on your nature journey.
Thanks for that. And yes, it's well and truly kicked off. I like to think of it as pre-leap. So you can use it to go and talk to an organization like yourself or a professional like yourself and say, well, we've now got some understanding of baseline, help us now build what we need to build to respond to what the TNFD not so much is telling us we need to do, but giving us guidance about what to do. And I think it's incredibly telling that the TNFD, I think it was in the last 24 hours, and Jenni and Josué, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but they actually published their program of work leading up to and at COP30. Now, this is a conversation by TNFD at a climate COP. And so you can see the linkage coming down the line. Very important. Thank you so much for that, Josué. I do have a Dorothy Dixer, which Jenni has heard, but Josué hasn't. So I'll get Jenni to answer first, and then Josué can reflect. The question is, so the benchmark, the WBA benchmark, shows that every element of the methodology is actually being met by at least one company somewhere in the world. As you said, the art of the possible is there. So from your perspectives, your individual perspectives, what's the most powerful lever, do you think, to help companies scale from these pockets of best practice to actually system-wide adoption? So Jenni, you first.
Yeah, thank you. It's hard to narrow it down to one. I was going to cheat and say two, but I won't. I think something that we see is on a technical level, a lot of the sustainability teams are completely on board and they want to do more. But I mentioned that we look at governance indicators, and when we look at board expertise, C-suite kind of accountability for nature, strategy, and things like this, a lot of these building blocks are not there in the same way as they've sort of been built in for climate. And it's been mentioned that nature can be very complicated. It can be very data driven. It can be difficult to kind of capture those senior leaders' attention and to get them on board. So I would say if we really focus on building understanding and capacity at that kind of C-suite and director level, I think that would be, for me, the most important thing because a lot of the other building blocks are there. They just need a bit more buy-in in order to be scaled.
Okay, so capacity building at ELT and for that matter, the board. Jose.
Thank you, Andrew. I might just to riff of a similar theme. I'm going to give a couple of very technical, or very specific on ramps, let's call them. Jenni's completely right. The corporates and corporate boards, senior executives have been on a very long journey when it comes to climate. It's something that they understand. Some of them more reluctantly than others accept that it must happen, but they get the logic. One thing that we recommend is for us to leverage essentially that as an on-ramp to begin to think about nature. Because let's remember, the distinction between climate and nature is actually a fairly artificial one. If we start to, for example, apply a nature lens onto climate scenario analysis, so essentially building into a structure that is already very well understood by most corporates, but to begin to extend the analysis to the interrelationship between climate change and nature decline or ecosystem change, that's one way in which businesses can begin to onboard into that existing mental framework, something that's otherwise relatively new. The other point I'd make very briefly is to extend the same theme. The leap assessment is one way, it's not the only way, but one way to really pin down somewhere in the value chain and in a way that translates into financial risk and opportunity, the role that nature plays. The more we bring nature into the boardroom, the better understood that concept is.
Yeah, so reveal the value. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Now we're just a tiny bit over time, but not much. I like to think flowers that bloom. Big thank you to Jenni and the WBA team for the opportunity of this sprint series over the next few weeks, and particularly to Jose for his reflections as well. Our next sprint in this series is on corporate performance and accountability, and that's happening on Tuesday, the 4th of November, also at 5:30, and you can register now via our website. And for those of you who would like to go further on nature-related performance, the BCSDA's Nature Action Program, including the Nature Maturity Assessment, which we're delivering with BWD Strategic, is now open to member companies that are seeking to assess their readiness and build credibility transition plans. So give us a chat. If your organisation isn't a member yet, then why don't you go and have a look on our website to understand more about membership, and you can make an inquiry form if you'd like to know further. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to speakers and to our participants and attendees. A copy of the recording will be available on our YouTube page very soon. And the recording itself will be available to the members via our weekly newsletter on Monday morning, and then soon afterwards for those who are not in our membership. But for now, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you at the next sprint on the 4th of November. Bye for now.